Dr. Jesse Papenburg, you're here, finally. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to be here, Dave.
This is episode 1. I'm very glad that you're actually the first guest that we have on this show, this podcast and project. Jesse Papenburg is he's a star in my book. He's a star in many people's books. He's a microbiologist. He's an infectious diseases specialist, and he's a pediatrician at the Montreal Children's. You're someone that I've known for a very, very long time, who I have a tremendous amount of respect and admiration for. So I'm really, really thrilled that you're the one that gets to cut the rope with us today. So thank you for joining us. We're a year into this pandemic, and
it's been a marathon.
How do you feel?
Yeah, it's been a marathon. I would say from a personal perspective, there's just no end to the amount of work that I can do or that's needed to be done. And certainly, there are so many people that are chipping in from, if I'm thinking professionally, from in the medical field or other fields that are related to fighting this pandemic. So it's been hard because as I said, there's just limitless amounts of potential projects and things that we can try and do to just chip away each in our own way at all the different issues that have come up. And the issues have been changing almost weekly. So it's also been fascinating in that sense that we have learned so much in the last 13 months or so. And who would have thought, when you think back to March of 2020, when the spit was really hitting the fan and we were shutting things down, that by the end of the calendar year, there would already be vaccines available for use that are highly effective at preventing symptomatic infection. I mean, not many experts would have predicted that it would happen so quickly and with such success.
Do you feel that the fact that science has evolved rapidly in the last year out of necessity, what is the lasting impact of that kind of cadence on the medical field going forward?
Oh, I think people who do meta research are going to have a field day with this natural experiment in terms of, by meta research, I mean like researching the research. And there's been an explosion of publications and studies. And with that, there's a lot of good. Like we've obviously moved at light speed in terms of generating knowledge and generating valid knowledge, good knowledge. Whether it be with diagnostics, with the vaccines, and with therapeutics as well. Just think back to initially, we didn't know what to treat these infections with, and people were throwing just about anything at it, like hydroxychloroquine, if you remember.
I vaguely remember that, yes.
That and it really it did take people coming together across the world to put together high quality studies to show that drug did not work. And it's just as important to show which drugs work as the ones that don't, because you don't want to be causing harm with a drug that has some side effects if it's not going to give you any benefit.
And yet there is this mountain of skepticism that's out there, which is in contrast to everything that you're saying right now. The naysaying, the anti-vaxxing, the apprehension. Is this something that you feel, particularly with COVID, has hit, another level, or is it another dimension, or is this something that you've had to deal with in your practice?
I would say that we have definitely had to deal with, vaccine hesitancy for years now. And vaccine hesitancy is really a spectrum, right, of behaviors and attitudes that can go from complete, absolute refusal to have anything to do with that type of preventive medicine to perhaps having just some questions or uncertainties about either a specific product or a sequence of vaccines or the schedule or so it's hard to lump all these things together. But I think what we have now in 2020 and 2021 is just obviously means of communications between persons. It's unbelievable, with whether it be social media or just the ability to speak to somebody across the globe and get their opinion about something, and a deluge of information out there, and some of it being solid, verifiable, and valid, and others being somebody's opinion or somebody's interpretation of a well-performed study, but their interpretation might not be correct either. So it's certainly a huge challenge, and we've seen it at different times focus in on perhaps different aspects of the pandemic and the pandemic response. At one point, I don't know if you remember, there was controversy about, are the PCR-based tests too sensitive, and we're actually falsely elevating the number of cases, and it's not that it's overestimating the size of the pandemic.
When the government flipped, in terms of advocating the use and the wearing of masks, initially it was seen as something that was not laughable but not impactful to prevent the spread. Now it's part of who we are. It's an extension of our faces.
Well, I think the mask issue is interesting, and then I noticed you used the word flipped as kind of a flip flop and it's usually kind of derogatory, right? That
right.
Somebody who flip flops is not making they're not able to choose properly, and you can't
or
can't
they were
be trusted.
wrong, and then they come to realize that they were wrong. There's so many ways to interpret that, right?
Yeah, and but at the same time, we were all, what's that expression? We were all building this plane as we were flying it, or so there was new information coming in, and were public health officials slow in adopting masks in North America or in Canada? They were probably too slow, yeah. But at the same time, when you go into a certain situation with a certain paradigm, and you're faced also with constraints, such as the fact that we didn't have unlimited supplies of medical grade masks at the time. And we just didn't know how the public was going to react also to those types of measures. So that as new information came, or as science evolved, the guidelines and recommendations evolved as well. And even if it's based in science, and even if as we learn more about it, we say, okay, now we're going to pivot a little bit because this is what we think is the right thing to do now. A part of being successful in whatever intervention that is going to be the messaging. And now the messaging needs to be on point right from the get-go because things are moving so fast. The messaging needs to be clear. And it hasn't always been the case.
When you look at what you've seen at the Children's Hospital, we know that children don't react to the virus typically the way adults do, and we know that various adults themselves don't all react the same. That as they get older and more compromised, obviously the impact is more drastic. What have you seen typically at the hospital in terms of how sick children have gotten and how many sick children have come through the hospital doors?
Well, I think first of all, you're right. The number one observation has been that kids don't get as sick as adults. It's just that there's probably a higher proportion of kids who have asymptomatic infections, so really not noticeable at all to anybody. Or if they do get a symptomatic infection, it'll tend to be limited to the upper respiratory tract. So, like cough and cold type syndrome, maybe some fever, but not really ill enough to require hospitalization. And even though kids represent, I think roughly 30% of infections these days, 25 to 30%, depending on what part of the country you're in, they still only represent less than 1% of hospitalizations. So think about it.
Yeah.
That there's a lot of kids that are getting infected, but very, very few of them that are getting sick enough to get hospitalized.
And what do we know about how they are able to be conduits to infect the adults? Because I know that has also changed a little bit and evolved over time, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that initially we had this thinking that somehow kids were protected from getting infected, and certainly we weren't detecting as many infections in kids. And even studies that were looking at household transmission, it looked like kids were less frequently the index case, or the case that would spread to other people in the household. And then with a little bit more understanding of what's going on, we've come to realize that perhaps there was a little bit of bias in those studies, in that children were less frequently getting detected as the first case because they might not have had symptoms to begin with. And they may have been the person that brought the case into the household. That being said, there are other data out there that still seem to suggest that kids do play a role in in community transmission. There's no doubt about that. But the major drivers of community transmission, these data coming from the States really kind of show this, are the 20 to 40-year-olds. That the infections in this age group tend to precede and continue to drive a local spread of the virus.
And there's a medical reason for that?
I think it has much more to do with, I think there are two things. One that is more social. So the social interactions and mixing that young adults have, especially young adults in the workforce. And that has part of what to do with how their role in community transmission. And then there's also this is still being worked out, and it's mostly still hypothesis. But the type of infections that you've had in your recent past also, to a certain degree, modify your risk of infection with other viruses. And we think that some of the common cold coronaviruses that are perhaps more prevalent in kids have offered some degree of protection or ability for kids to not get as sick, or perhaps not shed as much virus, or not shed as much infectious virus. But this is really kind of complicated stuff that we're just starting to kind of scratch away at the surface.
Can you understand, if we take that, can you reconcile that with apprehension that parents would have in terms of eventually vaccinating their children against COVID-19?
Yeah, so I think what you're getting at is considering the fact that kids seem to be less at risk for developing a severe COVID infection. How do we make decisions about vaccinating this part of our population? Is that what you're asking? Yeah. So the first thing is I think we're all aware of that from a public health perspective, from vaccinology perspective. So we're doing it in a stepwise manner. So I don't know if you're aware, but for instance, the Pfizer vaccine is the first to have completed a randomized trial in 12 to 15-year-olds. And the data seem to be very good in terms of extremely high efficacy and no signals related to adverse events that would be beyond what was already expected, already known in the adult population. And that kind of makes sense, because over 12, we expect that kids' immune system is going to respond in a way that's pretty similar to an adult immune system. So if I'm thinking ahead, like in the immediate future, those data have already been submitted to the FDA, and they're going to be, or if they're not, they may have already been submitted to Health Canada as well. And I think that the timeline for potentially vaccinating children above age 12 will be September. So how does that, like, what is that, like, is that making people anxious, or are people really looking forward to
What do you? That's
the
actually one of my
opportunity?
questions. Are
Yeah.
you seeing apprehension? Or are you seeing people that are eager to get their children inoculated?
I think that you could ask, 5 of your friends who have kids, and you might get 5 different answers.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And I think that, what we need to, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that the way out of this pandemic and the way back to a normal life in Canada and around the world really is through vaccination. And
That's the outlet. That's the way out.
that is clearly the way out. And if you look at the modeling that's being done now in the United States and in Canada, we can see a light at the end of the tunnel, and it's the number one factor that will determine whether or not we can indeed go through a fall and winter in 2021, 2022 that is almost normal, or is if we reach our targets for vaccination, if we are successful in our vaccination campaigns. And children are a big chunk of the Canadian population, and
So you can't achieve herd immunity without vaccinating children.
I don't see any way of doing that without vaccinating kids.
If people are reticent to vaccinate their children, what could that mean about the potential perpetuity of the virus?
Well, I think people are still, nobody has a crystal ball in terms of what will happen to SARS-CoV-2 in a post-pandemic world. Is it going to become just another influenza-like illness? And I'm saying just another influenza-like illness, but every year influenza hospitalizations across Canada, for the elderly, for the very young, it's a huge burden. Mortality, influenza, year in, year out. It's a major public health concern. But I think that what we're hoping for is that SARS-CoV-2 is going to become another seasonal respiratory virus that will indeed cause a burden of disease, but not disproportionate to other viruses that we know.
So it's here to stay to a certain extent, is what you would anticipate?
I would think so. But how, when are we going to get to that point where it is for most people an annoyance and not a 5-10% risk of hospitalization or death is I think that's where the concept of herd immunity comes in. Because if you think about it, even if we've protected with really good vaccines a large proportion of our most vulnerable, none of these vaccines is perfect. Some people, for whatever reason, wouldn't have been able to have get the vaccine, or will their immune system just won't have responded to it very well. And the less population level immunity there is, the more transmission there is, and the more transmission there is, you just eventually wind up hitting those people that are susceptible to it and are going to get sick, potentially get very sick and require hospitalization, and all the issues that go around with that, not only for the individual but from society as a whole, that the burden on our healthcare system. So to just get back to the idea of what's going to happen to if we don't vaccinate our children when the time comes, maybe we can think about it. Well, what's going to happen if we do, and think about the benefits that vaccination could bring to us, and just starting off with those 12 to 15-year-olds. Children across Canada have been doing high school or middle school from distance learning, and I think that is, although it was necessary for a certain amount of time, I think that we need in-person schooling from a developmental perspective, a social perspective. We need our teenagers to grow up together and learn those skills and get those experiences that can only be achieved in group settings. And I think that vaccinating this older part of our pediatric population will allow that aspect to happen in a much safer and less truncated manner that we've been sending kids to school, pulling them back, shutting them down, opening up again. And I'm not on the front lines in terms of mental health, but I can tell you, friends of mine who work in the Montreal Children's Hospital emergency department, they feel it. They feel the distress of these older kids, these teenagers who have had their social structures upended.
It's pretty much how much you feed off that social interaction at that age. I mean, it's pretty much your entire life. It's that point in your life where you start rejecting your parents because you derive so much self-worth and satisfaction from that social setting. If that's totally cut off from them, it's pretty heartbreaking when you think about it. It's very disheartening.
Yeah, it's been either cut off or modulated through screens.
Yeah.
That and I think that's not a positive thing. So what I'm looking at is, when I think of the different lights I see at the end of this tunnel, one of them is getting our teenagers protected and getting schools to be a really safe place for them to interact in the way that they need to interact.
Have you had parents come to you in the recent months and say, we're really worried about vaccinating our child, and where you've had to really alleviate concerns?
Honestly, I have not yet, and I think that's because we're still not there collectively, even, right? I think we're still not. Most people are not thinking about vaccinating their kids. The only people that have come forward to me are individuals who have said, "I have kids of this age or that age. Do you know of any studies where they could get enrolled into?" So they can be part of a vaccine study in children, because they want their kids to have that opportunity to, even though obviously they would be randomized to either get the vaccine or to get a placebo, they would like that opportunity as soon as possible, even before it becomes available at a larger scale. So those are the people that have come to see me, but that just might be because of the type of work that I do. Perhaps people who are more hesitant aren't inclined to come see me because they feel that maybe my narrative won't fit with what their concerns are. I don't know, but I think that collectively we're still like we just had. When 45 people age 45 and up were allowed to get the AstraZeneca vaccine here in Quebec, there was quite I think there was a part of that population that really went for it and really ran for it, and they wanted it and they got it quickly. And we're still working our way kind of down the ladder in terms of age, because age is the number one risk factor for severe disease, and we're still, I think, not yet either excited nor worried about vaccinating kids, because it seems like we're not there yet. But as I said, I would say that in September there's a good chance that we're going to start looking at vaccinating some of these older kids, but for younger age groups, not before 2022. And the reason for that is really it needs to be done in a very stepwise manner. Because as you rightly pointed out, because the individual's benefit of being vaccinated will potentially decrease as they get as they're younger. In other words, the protection that what is the protection we're offering? Well, it's against a milder form of disease principally. Then we have to make really sure that product is also safe in that age group. So that's why it's going to be a stepwise evaluation.
Do we look at this correlation between we vaccinate children last because they seem to be the less impacted in the development of a vaccine in those different stages? Are children always seen as the last ones to receive the vaccine?
That's a great point, and I'd actually never really contemplated that, because, and I'll tell you that just as in general, whether for drugs or vaccines, these products are usually initially tested as they go through the different phases of the development process. Phase 1 trials, we're looking just at, principally at safety. Phase 2, where we're looking a little bit as well, does it do what we're expecting it to do, and we're getting more numbers to see whether it's safe. And then phase 3, where you're really powered to be able to say, well, does it make a significant difference in what it's supposed to do, and are we seeing any sort of side effects that might be worrisome with this product? Children are, in a lot of ways, I guess, disadvantaged by the fact that these products always get evaluated in adults first, because we want to make sure that they're safe, in adults before we start, doing these tests on kids.
And that would be the same thing, for example, for like the chicken pox or the measles, like these diseases or viruses, that are much more child-centric. The way that those vaccines were developed were always tested on adults first and then on children, even though we were trying to target children ultimately?
Well, some of the initial studies would have been done on adults first, yes. But then if you're looking at the actual efficacy of the vaccine to prevent disease, then absolutely it was studied in children at a large scale. Once we saw that it was safe in adults, and then safe in small numbers of children, and then we went bigger studies to look at the efficacy in kids. We do a lot in vaccines. We do a lot of what we call bridging studies or immunogenicity studies, where especially if the outcome is very rare or is relatively rare, and you need to do really large scale studies to be able to observe a difference in groups of this rare outcome. Sometimes we can, if we've established that, for instance, a certain level of antibodies in the blood offers protection, then instead of doing a study that looks at does the disease occur in this population, what we can do is vaccinate a smaller number of people and say, well, do they get protective levels of antibodies from this product? And if so, we infer that they're protected at that point. And that often is enough, depending on how well the product's been studied in other groups, to allow for its licensure and its use more broadly. So we sometimes see that in pediatrics.
What would you see as a valid concern that a parent would have to not want to vaccinate a child? Are there medical arguments, and is there medical evidence to back that argument or that position up?
So are you talking about vaccines in general, or for...
Well, we could look at COVID right now. Do you see from how things have evolved and how this vaccine has been developed, are there legitimate arguments against vaccinating in specific circumstances as far as children are concerned?
Well, I think that any parent who has concerns, I think that it's important to validate them in the sense that it's good that everybody I think everybody wants to do the right thing for their kids. Like, I got to kind of start off from that perspective, that whoever is that's across from you, really what they want is that their kid be happy and healthy.
Yeah. That's a good point.
So once we're like, it's established that both of us have that same goal in mind, then the question is, well, what is it that's worrying somebody, or what is the concern that person has? And it's really variable, and it's sometimes really surprising to hear what it is that a parent is worried about with regards to a specific vaccine or vaccines in general, and it oftentimes has to do with their own lived experience, or what they've heard of experiences of friends or things that they've read or heard on TV or social media or whatever. And before understanding that, there's no point in going on into any sort of spiel about vaccines, because you might just be missing the boat completely. And some people are really going to respond well to data and facts and say, well, this is the risk that's posed by the disease, and these are the potential benefits of the vaccine, and we've studied this vaccine, and we know that there are these side effects. The severe ones are extremely rare. The ones that are more common are easy to handle and are temporary. And if you lay that out to them, then it becomes a very easy sell or easy decision for them to make.
If we dispel the not necessarily dispel, if we address the larger theories, for example, the rollout is too quick. There's no way that an efficient and a properly working vaccine and a safe vaccine could be developed in 8 or 9 months. That's the one thing that we hear over and over again. What's your response to that?
Yeah, well, it is amazing. It is jaw-dropping, but it didn't come out of nowhere. It's not like in 2020, all of a sudden we had people start to think about these vaccines. There have been people who've been working their entire professional lives on the methods and the technologies had been developed for these vaccines. So we've had tremendous advances in genomics and our all sorts of genetic technologies that allowed for the mRNA vaccines to be even an idea. And then these vaccines have been studied for other purposes already. So this was a platform that was kind of revved up and ready to go. And just the platform itself allowed for once the sequence of the virus had been distributed worldwide, different people or different groups were able to use that information to develop vaccines very quickly. And the mRNA vaccine is one platform that, in particular, it's very fast to be able to develop the product. So I think the first thing is that these vaccines are new, but they're not new. Like I said, there have been groups that have been working on either the adenovirus vector vaccines or the mRNA vaccines for literally decades. And we've learned a lot also just from SARS, the initial SARS, from MERS, from Ebola, from Zika. There was a lot of work trying to develop vaccines for these epidemics and to develop them quickly,
yeah,
and strategies to be able to do that.
And they've been efficient.
So that we've learned from mistakes and also or inefficiencies, and developed. I would say the collaboration has been colossal. If you think about multinational companies joining together to realizing that they have one strength, together they can do something much more expediently. So the level of collaboration is unheard of. And finally, I think and perhaps from my perspective, most importantly, is that these phase 1, 2, 3 trials have all been done, instead of being done one after another, they've all started in parallel, and that saved a lot of time. But the bottom line is that if you think about the mRNA vaccines, they had 40,000 people that were evaluated in for each of these products. Same thing for AstraZeneca. So tens of thousands of people that were the subjects that were evaluated, placebo or the actual product, to look at to give the power to be statistical power to see that do these vaccines work or not. And what are the side effects that we need to be concerned about? So, and then from a regulatory perspective, so Health Canada, the FDA, they look at these data and they then decide, is this product A, safe, and B, does it do what it's supposed to do? Is it efficient? And that process has not, it is, again, like obviously Health Canada has, everything is fast tracked and things are looked at as quickly as possible, but at the same time, it's still, evaluated in a very thorough manner and in ways beyond what we'd even imagine, in terms of, the quality assurance of the product itself, how the manufacturers have to show that in each vial that what is in there and make sure that from batch to batch, it's the same thing, whether that's produced in their North American factory or produced in their European factory. So there's a lot of information in that Health Canada or FDA submission that doesn't get any media attention, but it's important from a quality perspective. So that still is being checked, and we're using the same parameters and these that we would for any other product. And in fact, these parameters were set out a priori saying that in order to approve a vaccine, we're not going to do it unless it meets certain requirements. And the FDA and Health Canada have both been doing that, quickly, but still very thoroughly. And the last thing is, okay, once these products have then made it onto the market, there's what we call phase 4 studies, so post-marketing. So once the products are being used outside of the setting of a trial, but in the field, it's been amazing for me to see how there's been some tremendous data coming out of the UK, and we've learned so much from the UK in terms of what is the effectiveness of the first dose of either the mRNA vaccines or the AstraZeneca vaccine. And it's allowed us to spread out the interval between our doses with some good epidemiologic data to show that, the first dose offers really good protection. The second dose bumps it up, but the marginal benefit is not enough to say that everybody should get their first 2 doses.
So what are the stats now for the first dose? Where are we at now?
Yeah, so we know that in particular in otherwise healthy, relatively young adults, we're looking at roughly 80% protection against getting any sort of infection, and probably higher than that against hospitalization and death. Now, the numbers are a little bit lower for the elderly or those in long-term care facilities, but still really good for protecting against hospitalization and death, above 80% for both of those. So, I think we're at a point now where a lot of jurisdictions are, now that they've been able to give a first dose to the most vulnerable and are kind of moving down the line, we're definitely looking at giving that second dose to perhaps very specific populations, whether it be people who have known immunodeficiencies or immunocompromised, say like a transplant recipient. We know that in these people, they don't have as good of an antibody response. So probably we're going to start giving that second dose sooner for some very specific populations, or in long-term care facilities, we're due now for that second dose.
Let's look at another theory that we've heard often just in the realm of vaccination, is that big pharma is a greedy, corporately driven entity, and that has, those motives in mind, that we should be wary of that. When we take that idea or that perception that many people have, and we combine that with today's pandemic, how do you alleviate those concerns, or how do you address that? That's this apprehension that big pharma is not necessarily seen by everyone as an ally in here.
Well, I can tell you myself that anything and any process whereby there are financial interests involved, I think we need to have a certain degree of skepticism, or a healthy degree of skepticism, when looking at those data, on the other hand, as a public health person with a public health perspective and epidemiologist, I am well equipped to look at the data that we have, and to make decisions whether or not the product is going to do what it's supposed to do. And I would say that there are definitely flaws in the system, and there are going to be there's going to be a lot of money spent and a lot of money invested, and a lot of that is public money. In the United States, hundreds of millions of dollars have been of federal funds have been invested in the vaccine development program, beyond the rollout, but the R&D. So there has been this joint effort of industry and government. And we have to make sure that these public funds are being well spent. So for me, that's my major concern. But to think that there is I do not see any reason to distrust the results that were being observed, or to distrust the science that's coming out of it. And some products have worked, some products haven't. and the manufacturers that had those products that had whatever problems and they weren't able to get beyond the initial phases, they're readjusting and they're changing their strategies. And I think that just shows that the system is really just, promoting getting as many products as possible that are safe and effective available for distribution across the world.
So how do you deal with this next level of apprehension or skepticism, which I think is probably the most important one that we've had to deal with so far, which is a parent saying, I'm the parent. I know what's best for my child, and I want to decide. I don't want to be told by a doctor, by a judge, by a lawyer, by, a government body how I'm going to decide how to best protect my child. So how do we deal with that concern?
I mean, it's tough because, and I have to tell you, maybe I'm not the best equipped for this because I'm not a behavioral scientist. My background's more in epidemiology and infectious diseases, but you have to try and find a way to reach that person so that they feel that they're empowered to make the right decision for their child. And I think fundamentally, people, that's what they want. I think we mentioned that before. Everybody wants their child's best interests, and you just have to find out what it is that is making that person either motivated, what would motivate them to protect their child with a vaccine, or what are they scared of, or what is it that is concerning them with regards to the use of a vaccine. And certainly there are some people who are, and have an anti-establishment bend to them, that anything that is forced upon them, they will view with distrust. As
a violation of their right to choose.
Yeah, and I don't know. I think that these people generally need to be shown the benefits that they personally and society as a whole might get from their actions. As opposed to kind of using the carrot more than the stick.
There have been cases that have been brought to some judges' courtrooms with regards to parents that are disagreeing about the potential vaccination. And what we are seeing is that the judges are very scientifically driven. I mean, it does rest on expert opinion. And it's doctors that are advocating whether you need to vaccinate or not. And so the courtroom is a very scientifically driven environment, and it yields very scientifically driven decisions. But it is also, it has to wrestle with the use of or the exercise of parental authority. And when both parents have parental authority and there's a clash on giving the vaccine or not, or any kind of treatment, it really is it creates a predicament for the courtroom, for a judge that has to decide, and the judge is not a doctor, based on science, in terms of what is in the child's superior interest. And so it has been a situation that, there haven't been a whole lot of cases about it. There have been many cases on vaccination, but we do see oftentimes that the reason or the apprehension needs to be rooted in science. And there also has to be some kind of a pattern where if a child has never been vaccinated and all of a sudden after separation, one of the parents says, well, we want to vaccinate, sometimes that pattern will lead a judge to say, well, the child's never been vaccinated, and so why are we changing the decision now? But in a situation where you're in a global pandemic, you're looking, hindsight will not be very beneficial from what I'm seeing. Like, it really is scientifically driven. And that's a concern that I think many judges are going to have, which I think this conversation is very interesting, because if it is rooted in science, then, let's discuss the science. And then let's deal with, the big markers that are out there in terms of the apprehension, in terms of pharma and the time, the speed, the side effects. This AstraZeneca situation has been a problem. It creates a marketing problem, a branding issue, and that has to be dealt with as well. And we've seen politicians, rush to get the AstraZeneca vaccine, just like as our Prime Minister did this week, being proud of the fact that this is the right vaccine to get, despite the fact that there are very rare occurrences of clotting and whatnot. Do we know, for example, in terms of the AstraZeneca, what are we seeing that the potential, the small risk that we've seen could also be present in children as well?
Well, at this point, I would be purely speculative because it hasn't been evaluated in
There's
in
no
children.
testing.
Yeah. But I can tell you from the perspective of the National Advisory Committee on Immunization, we did a very in-depth risk-benefit analysis that looked at, obviously, what we know, and there's a lot of unknown around what we know, but the risks that are associated with the clots that can follow the vaccine administration versus the protection that the vaccine offers, and that pendulum might swing depending on whether or not you're in a very low incidence area where you have very little risk of being infected, especially if you are able to take on your own measures to protect yourself because you're working at home, you don't see another soul, compared to a person who's a cook in a restaurant and is living in a high incidence area and needs to go out there to work. It's a different risk balance, risk benefit balance, and beyond those numbers. And I think you were kind of alluding to some of these things, and I wonder to what extent the court, how much weight they puts into these things, but. There's ethics, when you think about ethics, you think about principles of autonomy as well. You think about the good that something's offered to a person. You think about acceptability with regards to the individual and the community at large. Issues of feasibility. How can we get this done as well? And so all these things were also brought up from a public health perspective on how are we going to make a recommendation for this vaccine that we know works, but we also know has this rare but dangerous side effect. And we had to try and strike the right tone for that vaccine to be used in the right way and for people to feel that we've looked at it in a way that is as in-depth as possible and that they're getting enough information out there to be able to make decisions about getting vaccinated.
We see often that, I think from a Canadian perspective, there's a certain amount of trust in government. Obviously there's skepticism to various degrees, but I think that there is an amount of trust in government in the sense that sacrifice for us and we'll give something back. I think there's a reciprocity in our relationship with government that's very European. I feel that you'll pay a higher amount of taxes and theoretically we're supposed to give you back. I think it's questionable as to whether we're getting full value on our dollar, but so I think that is something that plays in favor of having this collective acceptance of, well, let's do this together, just like we all pay into this communal pot to have universal health care. Let's do this together. Let's lock down together. Let's vaccinate together, and let's do something for the greater good.
Well, and Dave, I think that, if you comparing us or our response to the United States, where our leaders have most frequently, I think, been in sync with our public health officials in terms of the way to go and the decisions that need to be made. Whereas in the United States, the public health recommendations and the political leadership often clashed. And I think that a lot of Americans paid a price because of that.
Yeah, there's politicizing an issue has an opportunity cost, and we've seen that to tragic degrees in the United States. I agree with that. What are you looking for in terms of how does this how do we ride out into the sunset? How do you see this kind of getting to a point where we can look back in retrospect and say that was something, but it's behind us?
Yeah, I think it's hard to talk about that now when there's still some parts of Canada that are really in the hardest part of a third wave with ICU admissions higher than they've ever been before for COVID-19. But I'm optimistic that with the vaccines that we have available and the number of doses that are coming into Canada, that this summer we're going to be looking at a level of community protection that's going to be high enough to start relaxing some of these public health measures. And again, optimistic that come school year, there's going to be a proportion of our kids that are going to be able to be vaccinated, and that we're going to be able to reach that level of population protection that will allow us to get more and more back to a pre-pandemic life.
Well, this is great. You got to promise that you come back at the next pandemic. Next time we go through this. Thank you so much for taking the time. I think a lot of people will have come to terms with a lot of the science that has not always been very clear. Things are evolving so rapidly on the medical sphere for people that are attuned and that are well versed on the subject. Imagine the layman that has to kind of deal with the emotions, and we're parenting our children and we're just coming to terms with something that we had no preparation for. So I think this, hopefully will be soothing to many people that needed it. So I feel soothed. So that's a good thing. Thank you so much. And I really hope you can grace us with your presence again soon.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. It's been fun.